Introducing the presenters for our session, Can Relativism Bring Peace? An Atheist and a Theist Compare Notes, is Wally Cox from Virginia Beach, Virginia. He's a professor at Regent University and just wrote a book called Tyranny Through Education, and it is in favor of the Separation Alliance, and he is looking for a publisher, hint, hint. Please welcome Wally Cox.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce our discussants or contestants or whatever it turns out to be. The title of our event, Can Relativism Bring Peace? An Atheist and a Theist Compare Notes. All I'm going to do is introduce these gentlemen. I really don't know how relativism is going to tie to separation, and I'm not going to try to figure out right now which one's the theist and which one's the atheist. Okay. So first, I'll introduce you to Sheldon Richman, closest to me. I'm sure you all recognize him. Sheldon is the editor of the Freeman Ideas on Liberty, published by the Foundation for Economic Education. He's also senior fellow at the Future for Freedom Foundation. He's the author of the book Separating School and State, How to Liberate America's Families. That's part of your membership benefit that we get, that book. He is also the author of the forthcoming book, Your Money and Your Life, Why We Must Abolish Income Tax, published by the Future Freedom Foundation. He was formerly senior editor at the Cato Institute, and before that at the Institute of Humane Studies at George Mason University. He's written widely on a variety of topics, including education, population and the environment, federal disaster policy, international trade, the Second Amendment, American history, computer privacy, and the Middle East. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Washington Times, Chicago Tribune, and numerous others. I have a feeling you wrote all of this. He has appeared on CNN's Crossfire and Both Sides with Jesse Jackson, CNBC's Business Insiders, and others. A former newspaper editor, he was graduated from Temple University in his hometown of Philadelphia. His three children are homeschooled. Here's Sheldon. Thank you.
I'm currently homeschooled too, although I wasn't earlier in my life. Well, thank you very much. Nice to be here again. This is a patented Marshall Fritz panel discussion. Only he could think these things up. This is not going to be a debate, as far as I know. I didn't plan to debate. I didn't bring the verbal boxing gloves with me because we're only comparing notes. And by that, I take it means you're going to find a broad area of agreement between me and Herb Titus, which is fine. Relativism, I checked my American Heritage Dictionary. Relativism, the definition was not whatever you want it to be. It didn't say, which I thought was kind of a contradiction. It said it's a theory that conceptions of truth and moral values are not absolute but are relative to the persons or groups holding them, which seems like a fairly faithful definition of this idea, which made me think that the idea of education based on relativism is an absurdity, is a contradiction in terms, because if you think about what education is supposed to be, it's the instilling a love of learning, it's the imparting of information, it's several things, it's the quest for knowledge. All those things seem to imply an objective frame of reference, an objective reality which is discoverable by human reason. And if you cut that idea, independent reality, off, away from the idea of education, I don't know what education would mean if there's not an independent, objective reality to be educated with reference to. I mean, think about it for a minute. What are you doing in the classroom or at home in a homeschooling environment if there's not? I mean, it's the real world, it's the objective world that gives us something to learn and to learn about. And I'm now talking not on the moral side of it, but simply on the let's say the metaphysical side of it. The fact is, the point is that there's something out there to learn, which is independent of us. Education would seem to make no sense if it's premised on relativism, because then you wouldn't need education. You would then just whatever you decide is true about anything is true by definition under the relativist assumptions, and education would become very, very different indeed if it would have any meaning at all after that, but I don't think it would. Now, let me posit the opposite of relativism. It would be what I would think of as objectivism, small o, no trademark sign after that. I'm not using now, at this point, Ayn Rand's conception of objectivism, but that would fall, I mean, hers is a particular philosophy that would fall under the general category of objectivism, namely, which has two components to it. One is that, in a metaphysical sense, there is a reality that's independent of us, that's discoverable, although I suppose there are some variants of objectivism that would say there's a reality independent of us, but it's not discoverable. I suppose Immanuel Kant could be put into this category. There is something out there, some philosophers would say. It's independent of us, but we won't ever know what it is. It's inaccessible to us. That's not the view I'm espousing here. I want to add to the idea that there's an independent world, that it's also open to human reason. So the idea is that reality is objective. It exists despite our hopes, wishes, dreams. If there's a brick wall there and you decide you don't want to see it, you're going to bump into it anyway. It's going to impede your progress, whether you like it or not, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. I think the real test for any philosopher who's a relativist, or any of the variants, a skeptic, let's say, is here's the test. Watch when they cross the street. Do they look both ways before they cross the street? I always thought this was a very good common sense test of a philosopher's sincerity when they espouse these doctrines of relativism and skepticism and other any of the many variants of denial that there is a independent reality. Do they look both ways before they cross the street? Because if you're a really devout relativist, there's no need. Now, of course, in some sense, evolution and natural selection would quickly take its course, and after a while, there wouldn't be many of those kinds of relativists left, would there? It'd be a form of, it wouldn't be, I don't know if it would be natural selection, but it'd be a form of selection. Now, the other side of objectivism, in the sense I'm using it now, again, small o, but it applies also to the capital O, objectivism, is that moral values are objective in the sense that they are neither subjective or arbitrary or intrinsic. And I'll let me quickly tell you what I think those terms mean. Intrinsic values, which sometimes that term is often used interchangeably with objective values, but I think there's a difference. A value is something, it seems to me that when you identify something as a value, you're identifying a relationship between a thing or an idea and a human agent, a valuer. I don't think there are values that exist independent of valuers. Now, I'm not adopting relativism at this point, because I can claim that there are characteristics that apply to all members of the human race, and it's based on their nature as human beings, which is objective, and the objective nature of the things we're talking about. Water is objectively good for the class of things known as human beings, actually all living beings, but let's talk about human beings for now. Why is water objectively good for human beings? I'm not strictly talking about moral values at this point, obviously. There's a sense beyond morality that you can talk about water being good. I mean, it sustains life, which is a good. It's something about the nature, our nature as physical beings, and the nature of water that makes that combination enhance the life or further the life of human beings. So it's a relationship based on facts, not arbitrary things we've invented in the relativist sense, but actual facts about human beings and this stuff that we call water. So that's a denial of the intrinsic theory. The intrinsic theory would say it's in the thing itself, not in relationship to any valuing agent, but just in the thing itself. The subjective theory would would say values are simply arbitrary. Whatever you decide is good for you is good for you. It's kind of absurd. If we decided today by some sort of mass delusion that arsenic was life-enhancing, and it would lengthen our lives and make us physically more fit, that belief would have some objective manifestations. The price of arsenic might go up as we all ran out to buy some. In an economic sense, it would be as if it were true in this very narrow sense. We would bid the price up because we all thought it was good for us. But then we'd all proceed to kill ourselves. And our beliefs wouldn't change that. The belief that it would extend our lives wouldn't change the fact that it would kill us or certainly make us sick. So, again, if that's the result of the combination of the natures of arsenic and our nature. Put them together and you don't get life enhancement or life extension, you get death. Again, it goes back to the looking both ways before you cross the street. These are facts you can't just blink away. Now, how do we know there's an objective reality out there? I mean, maybe, how do we know it's not just a figment of our imagination? Well, there's a story of a freshman who was taking Philosophy 101 at, I think, Harvard. This is a true story. And the student went up to the professor one day and said, can you prove to me that I really exist? And the professor, the Jewish professor, looked at the student and said, who's asking? And there's a lot of wisdom in that answer. And answering a question with a question sometimes can be the most effective way to answer the question. Because in a very fundamental sense, to ask a question about the world is to already presume a heck of a lot of information and a heck of a lot of knowledge. It does presume the existence of the questioner, the question, the person being questioned, and then a whole lot of other things. In other words, there's background information, there's axiomatic information, we can call it, that you can't escape. Aristotle pointed out that the law of identity was something that to even attack, you had to adopt it. Because if you come up with a proof that the law of identity, and your bottom line of your proof is therefore the law of identity is false, that doesn't also mean the law of identity is true. But if the law of identity is false, then that line doesn't mean what we think it means, because that depends on the law of identity. So to invalidate the law of identity, you have to use the law of identity to attempt to invalidate the law of identity. But that tells you something very, very special about the law of identity, that it must be in the nature of an axiomatic truth. Otherwise, you'd be able to escape it. If you can't escape it, that tells us something. Rand and others have extended that to the very idea of there being an independent, objective reality. To attack that, you have to use it. There's no way out of that. It's like being in this, paper bag that you can't fight your way out of. That's just the way things are. So to mount an assault on the idea that there is objective reality and that we can have knowledge of it entails a very fundamental contradiction. Because first of all, it seems to me you'd be stating an objective fact that there is no objective, independently existing reality. Well, if you're claiming that that's true, then you're claiming that's an independent, objective fact that's true whether you like it or not. Well, you're endowing that statement with all the characteristics of my statement that there is an independent, objective reality, which of course should go without saying undercuts any claim of relativism. Descartes had the famous apparent axiom, I think, therefore I am. He tried to find the one true certain statement, and he felt he could doubt everything but the fact that he was doubting. Now, on the surface, that sounds pretty persuasive. So he ends up with only the existence. You're only certain of one thing: the existence of your own consciousness, and the rest of you could all be imagined. I can't doubt the fact that I'm imagining under Descartes' system. But the fact is, I have no real reason to believe that all of you are existing. You could just be, the result of something I had to drink last night. I don't know, or earlier. The only thing I can't doubt is that I'm imagining this, or therefore that I am conscious of something. Now, there's a problem with this. There's a problem with trying to work from the idea that you're conscious to the idea that there's a real world out there. In fact, it goes the other way. Descartes' approach was what is known as the primacy of consciousness. The opposing view, of course, would be the primacy of existence, or the primacy of reality. And the argument being that if there were no existing independent reality, there'd be no consciousness, because consciousness is consciousness of something. Otherwise, the term, I don't know what the term would mean otherwise. Consciousness is radically dependent on something to be aware of. It's awareness. It's awareness of something. Take away all things to be aware of, there can't be awareness. And if I can cite Rand here again, that the idea of a consciousness which is conscious only of itself, again, is an impossibility. I mean, think about that for a second. Nothing to be conscious of except itself. I mean, it would be how can a contentless consciousness even know that it exists? It ends up just dissolving away. So we are stuck with the opening fact that there's a real world out there that we have to discover. It's there, independent of us, and now our job is just to go out and learn what it is. Now, I'm supposed to be representing the secular or atheist view. The question is, can a secularist believe in absolutes? And it seems to me, I don't know what the alternative is. You've all heard the line, the answer to the very emphatic claim that there are no absolutes except that one. It doesn't get you very far, and so I think we're stuck with the idea that there are things out there that exist apart from our likes or dislikes, and that we have to use our heads to go out and figure out what they are through all kinds of methods. But it seems to me, like I said, the law of identity doesn't really have to depend on anything. There's no alternative to it, and to even attempt to come up with one quickly leads to a collapse in absurdity. In fact, if I can be a little contentious here, and you'd probably be disappointed if I wasn't, maybe the religious outlook, again, I'll be deliberately provocative, offers a weaker foundation to this idea of an independent, immutable reality based on the law of identity, namely that a thing is what it is, that a thing has a nature. Now, the idea that a thing has a nature should not come as any surprise. I mean, imagine something existing that has no nature. Again, it's one of those empty ideas. I mean, to be is to be something specific. And there's no sense in the idea of a sort of general existence, that a thing is, but it doesn't have any characteristics. I mean, to be is to have characteristics. Now, that seems like a pretty solid beginning of knowledge, and as a guide to your discovery of what things are in particular. But I'm a little worried about the idea that there's a being that could change something's nature at will. Again, I'm back to my provocative stance here. And I'll just plant that, and you're welcome to bring this up. This isn't supposed to be a debate on theology, and I don't really mean it to be, but I figured Marshall would probably be disappointed if I didn't throw a grenade or two. As Mencken said, it's helpful every once in a while for someone to throw a dead cat into the temple. And I'm a fan of Mencken, so I'm stuck with that. Anyway, I mean, the law of identity seems a lot more shaky if there's a supreme being that could change the nature of something any time the being wanted to. So I'll leave it at that, just to be a troublemaker. Now to the question at hand: can relativism bring peace? Well, this is interesting. I mean, if we take relativism very seriously, why should we assume peace is a desideratum? I mean, that's just up for you to decide. For relativists, some people want peace, some people see peace as a value, and some people don't think peace is a value. So, if a relativist were to argue that relativism is what we need because that leads to tolerance, because that leads to peace, you have to ask him why does he seem to be positing peace and tolerance as absolute goods? He seems to be smuggling in some absolutism there, and we ought to call him on it and make him demonstrate why peace is better than war, and why tolerance is better than intolerance. So we shouldn't let him get away with that. I mean, I think generally peace and tolerance is good. I mean, fighting in the streets makes it hard to accomplish other things that we all want to accomplish. So I have no trouble accepting that generally. Not that I won't tolerate everything, or I don't think we should tolerate everything. Some things are beyond tolerance. State schools, I think, are beyond tolerance. But generally, those are fine. And but I think we should make the relativists prove that those are things to be desired, and they seem to be, like I said, smuggled in as desirable things. But I don't think they can really defend them very staunchly without giving up the bigger point they want to make, namely that we shouldn't assume that there is truth and good to be discovered. That's something that is left to each person's own will and decision. So it seems to me we can make a very strong case that we have a better chance of civility and peace if we accept that the statements we make regarding truths, both in the metaphysical and the moral sense, can be civilly discussed and eventually resolved through argumentation and through discovery, and an argument between two relativists seems to me gets nowhere, because there's no court of appeal. There's no reality to appeal to see who in fact is speaking more accurately and who is speaking less accurately. So it seems to me the real key to peace is to a commitment to the idea that there is an independent reality, that the relativists are wrong. It's not just a matter of whatever you want to decide. That these things can be discussed in rational terms and through argumentation, through gathering of evidence, etc., all those kinds of things, we can eventually resolve disputes because we have a common method, namely reason, and a common court of appeal, namely that real world, and that at least holds out the potential for resolution. And that engenders, in my view, a spirit of toleration and peace, rather than this irreconcilable root of relativism, where in the end we both stamp our feet at each other and say, no, it's what I believe, and you say what you believe, and then we both say, okay, we're both right, even though we're making absolutely contradictory statements. At that point, if we can't go our separate ways, the only recourse left to us may be fisticuffs, because again, there's no method or court of appeal to resolve the disputes. I will stop at that point, and hopefully I said enough to provoke some discussion.
Thank you, Sheldon. I think I'm here, so I'm going to keep on going with the next introduction, following your line. Herbert Titus. Thank you. Okay. Herb is a lawyer, an author, and an educator. He has taught constitutional law at the state universities of Oregon, Oklahoma, and Colorado, and at the private institutions of Oral Roberts University and Regent University in Virginia. He was the founding dean of the College of Law and Government at Regent, serving in that capacity from 1987 through July 1993. He has written numerous articles and book chapters on a variety of legal and public policy topics. In 1996, Mr. Titus was a candidate in 39 states for Vice President of the United States on the U.S. Taxpayers Party ticket. He, in fact, has a radio program now, I think, in Virginia Beach that broadcasts several times a week. He and his wife, Marilyn, who is with us also, hi, Marilyn, have been married for 35 years and have 4 children and 9 grandchildren. And both of these gentlemen, by the way, have writings and books and so forth on our tables over here. So would you welcome Herbert Titus, please?
Wally, thank you very much. It is a pleasure for me to come and to be on this panel with Sheldon Richman. As I tell Sheldon, I read his articles all the time, and I find myself more often than not in agreement with him. On this, though, we disagree. Sheldon went to the dictionary to find a definition of relativism. I went to the White House and found the personification of relativism. William Jefferson Clinton. As Sheldon has so ably discussed the philosophical and metaphysical ramifications of relativism, and yes, indeed, we would have some differences with regard to how God figures into all of that. Instead of joining him in a discussion on that, perhaps we can do that at the question and answer period, I'd like to talk about the political and legal implications of relativism. A couple of weeks ago, President Clinton addressed the issue of human equality at the annual Human Rights Dinner for the so-called gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered people in America. At this dinner, he issued a new Emancipation Proclamation. The old ideas of sexuality must go. It is time, proclaimed our president, to redefine, and I'm quoting, redefine in practical terms the immutable idea of equality. And of course what he had in mind was that with this redefinition of the immutable idea of equality, homosexual sodomy would be equal to heterosexual monogamy. And according to what he practices, fornication and adultery are the equivalent to covenant marriage. And I would assume that many of his supporters would also say that all sexual relations are equal without regard to sex, age, or species. If you doubt what I say, let me also quote to you from our president's statement that we need to expand our, quote, imagination in how we should live. Now, I believe that President Clinton believes that if we do not voluntarily expand our imagination, then it's time to enlist the power of the state to expand it for us. Indeed, I believe his speech at this particular dinner was a prelude to adding sexual orientation to the civil rights laws, which would be enforced by the nation, making sexual orientation one of those forbidden bases for discrimination along with race, sex, etc. But it was not just a speech to add sexual orientation to the civil rights laws to be enforced by the government. Rather, it is part of a larger ideological agenda designed to dismantle the nation's charter. He would take the provision of the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, and he would change it to, we think that these following opinions are reasonable. He would take the language, and instead of a nation built upon self-evident truths revealed by God, he would rebuild this nation upon reasonable opinions of an enlightened elite. Then he would take the words that all men are created equal, and he would retranslate that to every living human animal ought to be treated equally in as many ways as imaginable. Instead of a God-created legal and political order of equality among human beings, we must, according to Clinton, have an economic, social, and sexual egalitarian order as the elite imagination would have it be. Instead of the language that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he would translate that to that everyone's claim to life, liberty, and happiness should be tolerated, unless that claim conflicts with better claims of others, provided, however, that all claims of right should be subordinate to compelling state interests. So instead of a God-given and defined right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he is calling for a new order of forced toleration where God-given rights are to be trumped by man-invented rights, are overridden by compelling state interests. A relativistic, evolving legal and political order for an absolute, unchanging, godly legal and political order. Now, how is this transformation of American society to occur? Through the transformation of the minds of Americans. What Clinton has declared is a war against Americans who believe, like her founders did, that there are absolute unchanging rules imposed on man by Almighty God. Indeed, I believe he has declared war against God and against God's law, elevating his own imagination above God's revelation. How will he wage this war? What will be the means that he chooses? Through America's schools. How will he wage this war? What will be the means that he chooses? Through America's schools. Again, let me quote to you from Clinton's speech. He said that most people, as they grow older, become somewhat limited in their imaginations. Not surprising, Hillary Clinton is heading up a national movement for daycare. The younger you get them, the more likely that you can reshape their imaginations. I believe the national testing, Goals 2000, School to Work, all of the national education programs are really designed for the purpose of imposing a unitary political ideology upon America. Now, Barry Lynn, of course, supports this. If you remember what he said about the Establishment Clause, is he says all the Establishment Clause forbids is a religious uniformity or a religious ideology upon the people. But it doesn't forbid imposing a political ideology upon the people. Indeed, he likened education to the training of the military. And let me assure you that when someone enters the military, that in order to be an effective soldier, you have to think like a soldier. You have to live and be a soldier if you're going to be an effective soldier. And that, of course, is precisely what a statist education is designed to do, is for people who are educated there to think and be as the state would have them be. Now, this is not the first time that a political leader has proposed and implemented an educational agenda to force upon a nation's people a worldview dictated by the powerful on those who don't hold power. In 1786, Thomas Jefferson wrote the statute for religious freedom. And quoting from Jefferson, he said, "It is the impious presumption of legislators and rulers, civil and ecclesiastical, who being themselves but fallible and uninspired men, have assumed dominion over the faith of others, setting up their own opinions or modes of thinking as the only true and infallible, and as such endeavoring to impose them on others, have established and maintained false religions over the greatest part of the world and through all time." It is not new for nations' political leaders to attempt to impose a uniform ideology upon the people that they might better control those people. In Jefferson's time, that was precisely what the political agenda was in nations all over the world. Now, what was Jefferson's ammunition against this political homogeneity? Did he argue that it didn't work? No. It only worked too well. Did he come up with a bunch of statistics to show what was happening to the people? That it was not cost efficient? Or that people weren't performing well on the tests that might be administered to see whether or not they were learning what they were to be taught? No. He opposed it for one simple reason: it was wrong. And the basis upon which he relied to show that it was wrong was that it was contrary to God's created order. You remember the language of that great statute. It still appears on the statute books in the Commonwealth of Virginia, well aware that Almighty God created the mind free. You see, he began with the proposition that God created the heavens and the earth and all creatures in it, including all human beings. And he created the mind according to the law of freedom, and that for a civil ruler to coerce the minds of men was a violation of that law. Jefferson went on to say even God himself, even the holy author of our religion, did not coerce man to believe the truth that God offered to it. How dare impious rulers do what God himself would not do? From this foundational principle, based upon the law of God, he came up with three principles by which all nations should govern themselves. Principle number one, that there should be no taxation to support the propagation of opinions of any kind. Not just religious opinions, but of any kind of opinions. He called it sinful and tyrannical, both a violation of God's moral law and a violation of God's law for nations. That's what makes it sinful and tyrannical. He went on to state that not even school vouchers was consistent with the law of God. Some of you perhaps do not know, but that the school voucher system was the dominant educational system in America. If you look, for example, at the Massachusetts Constitution, dated 1784, you will see a Puritan form of school vouchers. It's interesting to me today that people who abhor the Puritans are actually walking with the Puritans who supported school vouchers. If you don't believe me, look at the first few sections of Article 1 of the Massachusetts Constitution. The difference between the Puritan school voucher and the proposed school vouchers today is that the person didn't send his money to Washington for it to be laundered and sent back to the parents to spend. It was far more efficient. All that had to be done was that the parent could take the money and give it to the teacher of their choice. Jefferson said, even that violates the law of God because it interferes with the parent's choice not to spend money for a teacher. Homeschoolers, you don't have to pass money from the father to the mother or the mother to the father in order to homeschool. Jefferson understood the law of liberty of the mind. The second principle he set forth was that there was no authority for the civil ruler to impose a test of religious orthodoxy upon any civil office holder. That particular principle led to the prohibition against religious tests that we find in Article 6 of the United States Constitution. It was not for the civil government to determine what is orthodox Christian faith. It was for the church to determine and the people to determine. The civil government had no jurisdiction over religious orthodoxy. The third principle under which he operated was that the civil government has absolutely no jurisdiction over the minds of men. This is the language of Jefferson. He said that the opinions of men are not the object of civil government, nor under its jurisdiction. Obviously, a tax-supported educational system takes the position that indeed education is the object of government. The minds of men are the object of government, and the government, of course, exercises jurisdiction through civil bureaucrats called teachers who are representing the government when they walk into the classroom. It's interesting that in today's regime, according to Barry Lynn, a teacher can't express a religious opinion. Only a student can in a tax-supported government schoolroom today. So a student who has a religious opinion never gets reinforced by the teacher. Only those students who have non-religious opinions would be reinforced. Now, James Madison explained this in his great remonstrance, in which he supported Jefferson's bill for establishing religious freedom. And he put it in the language of Article 1, Section 16 of the Virginia Constitution. You can still see this language in that document, although they've added a whole bunch of relativistic stuff following it, where it says, religion are the duty that we owe to our Creator, enforceable by reason and conviction, but not by force or violence. You see, both Madison and Jefferson understood that true liberty begins first with identifying those duties that God has exclusively reserved to himself. Those duties that God has ordained in His revelation that can only be enforceable by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. Or if you want to get theological about it, those duties that only the Holy Spirit has authority to enforce and not what the sword of the civil ruler has to enforce. This particular principle can be traced back to the teachings of the Lord Jesus Christ in Luke 20:25, where He said, "Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and unto God what belongs to God." Those duties that we owe that can only be enforced by reason and conviction belong exclusively to God. Only those other duties that God has ordained can also be enforced by force and violence belong to the civil ruler. Clinton's relativistic worldview must be imposed by force. He must declare war upon the American people, for his view of the world is contrary to God's reality. And any other political leader who holds to the view that man's imagination should be lifted up over God's revelation must ultimately use the power of the state, because the people, upon whose heart is written the truth, will simply not voluntarily follow such a leader. So relativism never brings peace. It only brings war. Only by God's law limiting the jurisdiction of the state will peace and harmony be restored to America.
We'd like to take this time for a question and answer, and we're making a special offer right now. For those of you who have not yet participated at that microphone, please feel free to do so first. And those of you who still have questions and would like some answers to those questions, you may respond or ask those after those others have asked their questions, if that makes sense. Please state your name and your place of origin.
My place of origin?
Well, directly before this conference.
Tony Moe from Central Pennsylvania. An alien. I have a comment to make on the question, which I think has been eloquently answered, that relativism necessarily leads to war rather than peace. We should note, I think, that it is being sold in the schools under the rubric of diversity training, under the mistaken notion that it produces peace rather than war. And I think it's expected that people's commitment to any set of beliefs will be so weakened that they won't be willing to fight for anything. However, what it does is simply liberate desire, and we revert to a Hobbesian condition of a war of all against all, in which simply the powerful enslave the less powerful. But I think while it's certainly the case that one can determine objective moral standards simply on the basis of an analysis of human nature, as Aristotle, for instance, tried to do, I think, Mr. Richmond, you have a certain difficulty in the same way that someone who is a Hobbesian would have a difficulty finding some basis for an obligation to live up to the contract that one has made if one is in a position to be able to get away with violating that contract or abrogating the contract. So too you may have a set of moral values objectively rooted in human nature. And at the same time, you still have the question, what is the source of the obligation to live that good life, to renounce vice, and to practice virtue, without some sort of divine sanction? It would seem to me that it would be, I'm not adamant about this, I haven't made up my mind fully about it, but it would be difficult to make a case for that obligation, even though one could perhaps understand to a great extent what a good life is. Thank you.
I'll just be very quick. You ask a question that obviously you could write books and books and books about, and therefore talk about for hours and hours. And I am not a professional philosopher who's working every day in these areas. So I'll answer in that spirit. Quickly, just suggest my approach. I mean, I think the obligation that comes out of the quest for the good life. I mean, and again, I can't endow this with a lot of detail at this point, but you're right. This was Aristotle's mission in part, and I think that's a fruitful route to pursue, even if it hasn't been completed. But I think that my hunch is that's the direction to go.
My name is Stephen McGarvey. I'm from Bluemont, Virginia, and my question is for Mr. Richmond. It's similar in the vein to the last question, which is, and I don't ask this to be confrontational, I'm genuinely curious. How can you say that we can know an absolute truth if you don't believe that there is a God that has ordained that absolute truth? If you say, you seem to be saying relativism is wrong, well, what is your standard if you don't have a God who sets the standards? Thank you.
Well, as I try to suggest, and this, I hope this doesn't become too autobiographical for me. As I tried to suggest, it seems to me any other starting point than an objective reality, frame of reference, is a non-starter. I mean, it doesn't get off the ground. Again, to attack this idea that there is a independently existing reality, you have to smuggle in quote objectivist assumptions to attack it, and in which case, you're then doing what Aristotle said you're doing if you try to attack the law of identity. It's a non-starter. Your system never gets going. So I think existence is sufficient in that sense for us to begin building knowledge about what exists. I don't see what's missing, and I'm not talking about moral values now or the moral life. I don't see what's just in terms of trying to get a handle on what the nature of reality is like. I don't see what's missing from this picture I've tried to draw. Namely, the starting point is there's got to be a real world out there, because anything else collapses in self-contradiction. So that's the only route left, and it seems to me that's enough to get your system going.
Lorenzo Gastanaga, Baltimore, Maryland. My question is for both gentlemen. Number one, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that both of you believe in both natural law, that there are natural laws that if you tamper with, you may run into deep trouble, number one. Number two, referring to Mr. Titus's quoting of our president, it seems that his attempts and his policies and those who think like him are actually an assault on tolerance, which can destroy civilized society. Please comment.
Well, our founders understood that there was such a thing as natural law, but they did not build the nation on that foundation. That's the reason why, if you look at the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, they use the term law of nature rather than natural law. Law of nature, as is articulated in Blackstone's commentaries, is God's actual will revealed in nature, rather than, as Blackstone also states, natural law, which is man's best understanding of God's will revealed in nature. They understood the distinction between God's actual revelation and man's best understanding. Now, obviously, whenever a man acts, or a human being acts, you see natural law in action, because that's based upon that person's best understanding. But one would never substitute a person's understanding, no matter how well educated, how well trained, for the actual revelation itself. With regard to the question of toleration, our founders rejected toleration. If you look at Article 1, Section 16 of the Virginia Constitution, you will see that they began with a rule of religious toleration, which was essentially this, that you could freely exercise religion so long as you didn't disturb the social order. Or another way of putting it, if you want to put it in modern terms, is that you could freely exercise religion unless there was an overriding compelling state interest. Now today, we have a regime of religious toleration, which in fact means that those who are intolerant will not be tolerated. That's the danger of toleration, is that ultimately there will be some who will not be tolerated.
Just a quick word about toleration. I know we don't have a lot of time. Toleration today has turned into the idea of approval. I think the people that Herb's talking about have an interest in having smuggled in that additional meaning to the word, but I don't think that's what the word originally meant. And in political terms, it shouldn't mean that. I mean, it seems to me someone who does something that you don't approve of, even deeply morally disapprove of, but who's not using violence, fraud, in other words, not violating anyone's rights, should have that, his rights should still be respected under law. And that's, I think, what generally was meant by the idea of toleration. We weren't going to politically persecute, or even privately persecute through physical force someone who does something that you disapprove of, assuming that person is now, again, like not violating rights, not using violence, not using harassment, or, not doing things which are defined in the criminal code. Those people should be left alone. You can ostracize them. You can use all sorts of voluntary ways to show your disapproval, not deal with the person, etc. But it's tolerance or toleration if legally that person's still permitted to be at liberty. And that's the contribution of the American political thinking, was that those people were not going to be jailed or beaten into submission until they crossed the line and actually committed what we think of as an actual crime.
Hi, Anthony Santelli, Fairfax, Virginia. This question is directed towards Professor Richmond.
Don't promote me.
It seems that you draw a distinction between the primacy of reality and the primacy of consciousness, and it seems that you come on the side of the primacy of reality. Now, as a believer in God, I believe that the consciousness of God existed first, and then he spoke reality into existence. In light of the latest theories of quantum mechanics that seem to question, reality, and that's in the sense as we seem to perceive it, how does this confront, I guess, since the primacy of reality with more an atheist view of things? And secondly, if reality came first, then where do you get free will from, and do you believe in free will or not?
All good questions. I had a feeling quantum mechanics was going to come up at some point. And I'm not an expert in quantum mechanics, and we're also very short on time, luckily for me. Yeah, there are certainly strange things that go on at the quantum level. I mean, I've done a little reading in this, so I have some sense of there's some very interesting things that go on there. But we can still debate whether theories about what go on there are true or not. Notice how that's still within the context of objectivity. It's not whatever you decide is going on at the quantum level is good enough, for no matter what you decide is true. We can still debate and test and see what seems to be more in accordance with the truth and what seems to be less consistent. So even that debate, where things are going on, and maybe we need terms now to identify things that we don't have good terms for yet. I mean, it's obviously different down there, but the point is, it still seems to be within the context, because we talk about how the theories of quantum mechanics are constantly upheld by the various experiments that are put on by scientists. So we can still talk about the truth or falsity of that, even though what goes on there doesn't seem to be exactly like what's going on at this level, at the macro level. I'm going to have to stop there because I'm getting the hook. Sorry.
Thank you very much.